Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Shana Hammerman. I'm the Associate Director of Jewish Studies at the Toby Center for Jewish Studies here at Stanford. And welcome to this conversation with Helene Wecker. We're grateful to our many co-sponsors for this evening's event. The Department of English, who's housing us right now, the Department of Comparative Literature, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies, the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley, and the Jewish Community Library of San Francisco, who is featuring the Hidden Palace in their one-day, one-book annual thing, so you can check that out. I am pleased to introduce tonight's presenters. I'll start with Ilana Gomel, who is an academic and a writer. Her latest academic books are Narrative, Space, and Time, Representing Impossible Topologies in Literature from Routledge in 2014, and Science Fiction, Alien Encounters and the Ethics of Posthumanism, Beyond the Golden Rule. Sounds really awesome, from Palgrave in 2014. She's currently working on a book project about narrative representations of post-utopia and editing a Palgrave reader of international fantasy. She's also a fiction writer and the author of more than 100 short stories, several novellas, and 4 novels. Her stories won several awards, including the Gravity Award for the Best Science Fiction Story in 2020. She's a member of Horror Writers of America. Her stories have been included in the recently published Jewish Book of Horror and in the 2 volumes of Zion's Fiction, the anthology of Israeli speculative fiction. Welcome, Ilana, and thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce my dear friend, Helene Wecker. She's the author of the New York Times bestselling The Golem and the Genie in 2013, which was awarded the Mythopoeic Award for Adult Literature, the Harold U. Riblow Prize, nominated for a Nebula Award, among others. Her second book, The Hidden Palace, which follows The Golem and the Genie into the 20th century, has just received the National Jewish Book Award for 2021, among other affirmations. Wecker's work crosses multiple genre boundaries, fantasy, historical fiction, and romance, and in this way, it felt to me like no other book I have read. Her characters and story play majestically with the elements, earth, fire, water, and air, and with the other elemental mysteries of humankind, love, and friendship. I imagine that many in this room have had the experience of encountering a work of art and thinking, oh, they make it look so easy. The idea being that this is a brilliant thing and it comes across with such ease if only I thought of it first. With Wecker's work, and I mean this in the most complimentary way possible, she does not make it look easy. The worlds that she creates in open deserts and tiny tenements inside otherworldly buildings and along city streets are so rich, so true, so deeply researched, and also so fantastical that I never once thought she made it look easy. Instead, on every page, I could stand back to admire the depth of her world building while feeling immersed in the world myself. With all the skill she brings, crafting the worlds of the Lower East Side, Little Syria, the Upper West Side, and across the ocean, Wecker never neglects the inner worlds of her many characters, bringing us into the minds of a bicycle-riding boy and his struggling mom, a generous cafe owner, a sickly heiress, and of course, our magical outcasts, golems, and genies. I loved being in their universe, and I hope I'll get to go back in. And for now, it is my pleasure to welcome Helene Wecker to Stanford.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. I feel like I can't follow that, and it's me. So I thought I would read a bit. Is that okay? For about 10 minutes or so over here. I will go. This, I have to tell you, this is my first actual in-person event like this for literally years. For obvious reasons. But I'm enjoying being with people again. That's just nice. At last, the first true freeze of winter arrived, and Central Park gave itself to the cold and snow. The vining roses were pruned back to a handful of canes. The elms on the mall grasped the sky with empty fingers. "I'm sorry," the golem said one night as they neared the Harlem Mere. "This will be a long walk back, and it's starting to snow again." "Stop worrying about me," said the genie, "and stop apologizing." "I can't help it. I feel like I'm putting you at risk." "You aren't asking me to jump in a river, Chava. I can manage a little snow." She sighed. "It's just louder now, or it feels louder. Oh, it's hard to explain." She hugged herself as she walked, clearly miserable. With the onset of winter, her clay body had grown stiff and uncomfortable, an expected effect and manageable as long as she walked often enough. But now, like arthritic joints that ached with the rain, the scream in her mind, her trapped creator in his endless anger, had grown sharper, more distracting. She'd begun to make careless mistakes at the bakery, such as forgetting the raisins in the challah dough, or doubling the baking powder in the cookies so that they swelled as large as biscuits. Thea Radson thought it a lingering effect of her widowhood. With each mishap, she cast a pitying look at her favorite employee, thinking, and who could blame the girl if she came unhinged? Do you think I'm coming unhinged? The golem asked suddenly. Do I think what? That I'm coming unhinged. It's what Thea thinks, though of course she doesn't say it. And no, she doesn't understand, but you do. So you must tell me, please. He blew out an impatient and unnecessary breath. Chava, you aren't coming unhinged, whatever that means. The winters are difficult for you. We knew this. It's all of a piece. And you're handling it far better than I would, were I to hear that man screaming in my head all the time. You make it sound like he's hurling curses at me, she muttered. It's simpler than that, like a tinnitus, I suppose, just louder lately. Better hear, though? She gazed about at the dark tableau of the park, felt with her distant senses the earth below them, its warmth banked and waiting. The seasons would turn, and she reminded herself. Her body would lose its stiffness and unease, and her mind would quiet once more. Yes, she said, better hear. Spring arrived as promised. The rains began, forcing them apart and indoors, she sewing in her room each night, he working in the shop. Without him, she grew restless. Her mind strayed toward the couples who hurried by outside, laughing beneath their umbrellas, their thoughts full of what might happen when they reached their warm apartments, their inviting beds. He, too, became tense and distractible, full of unsettled longings, uncertain of their welcome. He, who'd once sauntered up Fifth Avenue so confidently in search of Sophia Winston's mansion. And she, meanwhile, reviewed every conversation they'd ever had upon the subject of faithfulness, his opinions ringing in her mind like a punishment. Humans and their ridiculous rules. But she also recalled something that had happened before the rain separated them, a night when they passed a Lower East Side synagogue just as two women, clear at a glance as mother and daughter, emerged from its basement stairwell. The daughter's hair had hung down her back in damp coils. She'd shivered in the night air, nervous and excited, her pale face glowing. The older woman had put a comforting arm around her, and they'd hurried down the street together, mother whispering to daughter, the daughter nodding. It's late for a bath, isn't it? The genie had said as they disappeared. It's a mikveh, a ritual bath, she told him. And then, at his confusion, by Jewish law, a woman mustn't lie with her husband during her menses. Once it's ended, she immerses herself in the mikveh and recites a blessing. Brides do it, too, before the wedding ceremony. Ah, and the younger one? She marries in the morning. She'd waited for him to call it absurd or superstitious or any of his other usual complaints. But he'd only nodded as though half listening, his expression entirely opaque. Perhaps, she thought at her window, watching the rain. Perhaps. At last the rain ended. That night he arrived at her boarding house at their usual hour, and they walked north together in a charged silence. He could feel the barely perceptible mist that she always carried about herself, like the lightest touch upon his skin. And she wondered, had he always been so warm at her side, a heat that she could feel from an arm's length away? They entered the park and walked through the ramble, quiet and alone, making only the most inconsequential of comments. I've never noticed that path before. Look, the hillside's washed away. They followed the gill to where it calmed and widened, and the genie wondered why, for what felt like the first time in his hundreds of years, he found it impossible merely to say what he wanted. I'd expected the river to be higher after so much rain, he said instead, helpless, cursing himself. It's controlled by an aqueduct, she told him, so the rain doesn't affect it. Oh, he said, nonplussed. I'd assumed it was real, and they built the park around it. She smiled at this. Of course it's real, she said, and then, before he could protest, you know what I meant. Here, I'll show you. She unclasped her cloak, letting it fall to her feet. He nearly asked what she was doing, but lost his voice in surprise as her shirtwaist and skirt followed the cloak, and then shoes and stockings, too. Not once did she glance his way, only calmly rid herself of clothing, then walked down the bank and into the current, disappearing beneath the water. For long moments he was alone. Dumbfounded, he glanced back at the clothing that lay on the bank, as though to reassure himself that he hadn't imagined it all. And then the gill rippled as her head broke the surface. She emerged onto the bank, water running from her skin in rivulets as she came to stand before him. She didn't smile, but her eyes were alight. Her expression was one of challenge and expectation. He raised a hand, traced a finger along the edge of her cheek. The clinging droplets vanished into steam. What would you ask of me, Chava? He said quietly. A promise, she told him, that you will have only me. He realized he'd expected this. What surprised him was his willingness. And you'd promise the same? Yes, a whisper. Then I will have only you, he said. And I will have only you, she replied. They smiled at each other then, tentative, wondering at what they'd done. He took her hands, they were freezing cold, and drew her closer.
Okay, let's start the conversation. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an amazing experience. It's the first time in 2 years that I am surrounded by people, and it's a little unnerving, I have to say, but I really enjoy being here, and I really enjoy having this opportunity to talk to you. It's a fascinating book, and I have so many questions.
Thank you.
So I will start actually. Can you hear me okay, or do you want me to use a mic? We don't need a mic, but if we do, we'll use it. So let me start with something which I didn't intend to ask, but I will ask anyway. See, when I first read your book, The Golem and the Genie, which I absolutely loved, but my expectations were all wrong.
Oh.
I am a member of the horror writers of America, and I always believed that Jewish history is a perfect material for horror. And I said, oh, that's a book, And I love this book, but it's not horror. It's not even dark fantasy. It is a kind of romance, among other things. And I'll ask about those other things. I'll ask about fantasy and history. But I am just wanted to say that it's one of those books that really, really surprised me because it was not what I expected, and in a good way, So if you want to relate to this issue of why it's not darker than it is.
Probably because of the impetus of where it came from when I decided to write the book, which was that it was a very sort of distanced and highly fictionalized and slightly tangential way of explaining my own past and my relationship with my family and my husband's family. And so it isn't dark because I didn't want, well, for one thing, because that part of my life isn't a dark part of my life. It can be a difficult part of my life, and I think that's part of what lent the book its drive. But it's not dark. It's not horror. And I know that in some ways removes it slightly from specifically the golem myth. Yes. And that was actually something that when I visited Vered's class today, we talked about whether, how far you can sort of take the golem out of the milieu that it sort of originates in, and is it still how at what point has it lost what it sort of plugged into? But there is a dark part to her nature as a character that does come out pretty forcefully on occasion throughout both of the books. But yeah, it isn't, if I wanted to do like the Hammer horror version of this, I absolutely could. And that would be fun. It would be something else entirely. Oh my gosh, now I'm thinking of like the old Universal horror monster movies, and the Wolfman and versus Dracula and all that. And you could totally do that, but that wasn't what I was writing towards specifically. So that was somewhere else completely.
It's just a kind of tangential question, simply because I remember my surprise when I started reading your book and I realized it's not what I expected. And it was a good surprise because it's a very unusual book in many ways. And so now I will go back to a kind of more general question. I actually wanted to, to start with specific questions, but I will be perverse and I will start with a general question and then we'll go.
Perversity is always fun.
Yeah, I know. So my question relates to this. So I read your essay, which is a beautiful essay called "The Most Jewish Thing I Do," and you write, the words stayed with me, though grooved deep into my brain, and were joined by the urge to tell stories, and by some strange transitive property of the subconscious, my urge felt Jewish. And this is very interesting because I feel the same way, even though I don't write normally. Some of my stories have Jewish themes, but not many. And yet, somehow, I feel that what I write, the process of writing itself, is Jewish. So I would like you to elaborate on this issue, how, not what you write about, but the process of writing itself, why it feels Jewish, and what is the connection between Jewishness in whatever way you define it and storytelling itself, narrative itself.
So yeah, it's funny because so this is an essay that I have on my website. It's called "The Most Jewish Thing I Do," and it was written as a response. It was a thing that I wrote for the for the Jewish Book Council. They were like featured me on their website, and they have like these prompts, and one of the perennial prompts is, do you consider yourself a Jewish writer? And my response was that writing is the most Jewish thing I do. I'm not practicing per se. I'm intermarried. I eat lots of cheeseburgers and shrimp, and I'm not. If you looked at my life, you would not say this does not look like a Jewish life, the actions of a Jewish person. But the writing is like where I funnel all of that. And so, where does what makes the act of writing for me feel Jewish? I think. So I did a lot of thinking around this question, and also around stuff that I was writing for Vered students. And one thing that it sort of came down to for me was, what were the Jewish influences in my childhood? What were the cultural Jewish influences in my childhood? And a lot of it came from storytelling, and it was the sci-fi writers, the Asimov and Lem and so on. And it was Steven Spielberg movies. It was everything that was like either Hollywood or New York produced, that was produced by Jews, maybe didn't have Jewish content, but in some way was coded as Jewish, some of it. Comic books, Superman, X-Men, all of these Jewish creators writing these, stories about people who are othered. And that I took in all of that in this as sort of a religious catechism, I guess, in some ways. And that sort of became that was what made me want to tell stories, was having read these stories, knowing that, and the fact that these were Jewish creators and who were demonstrating what I took as Jewish values and Jewish perspective through their work. That imprinted on me, and that became what I wanted to do. And so I think what ended up happening was, okay, like when you're a kid, okay, you're teaching a kid the 10 Commandments. You're not going to sit down with a 5-year-old and say, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Okay, like you're going to tell them about Moses going up the mountain and coming back down with the tablets, and there's a golden calf. And it's a story, and it's a framework that you can then use to sort of put these, morals, values, whatever, in place. And so what it ended up for me, I sort of have this distinct sense, and I have no idea if this is like a gauche thing to say in a English department, but of storytelling as a moral act, of like, this is how, not as in moralizing, but as in you have a thing that you are figuring out, that you're trying to say, that you're trying to talk about, and you are increasing some amount of trying to increase some amount of human understanding about what is this thing. And that is what I am trying to put out into the world. And so that sort of, in my mind, got tied back to the religion and everything else.
That's an amazing explanation. Really beautiful. And I totally agree with you. And it's very interesting. You mentioned Isaac Asimov and Lamb. Now, I grew up in a totally secular milieu. I didn't know I was Jewish. I didn't even know, I still don't know actually what it means, but whatever. But I loved Asimov and Lamb. And I never knew until much later in life that both were Jewish. And Lamb is a Holocaust survivor, and a lot of his writings, I had no idea. But when I found out, it felt absolutely true. You know, they had to be Jewish because somehow expressing, Jewish history is an incredible storytelling activity in itself, not just telling stories about history, but history itself is a telling and retelling of the story of the Passover and, exile and whatever, and return to Zion. So Jewishness itself is a tissue of stories. So yes, storytelling itself is absolutely a kind of quintessential Jewish activity. Great. So, but let's move on and let's talk about Lamb and Asimov and and other fantasy and science fiction writers and you, because as opposed to my instinctive sense that, science fiction, fantasy, whatever, speculative fiction is the most Jewish genre there is, until recently, there was this debate whether Jewish fantasy exists or even should exist. So, great writers, Jewish American writers, Saul Bellow, whatever, all wrote psychological realism, and the same in Israel, and, Amos Oz, whatever. So I remember debates with people where I wrote articles about it, trying to prove that Jewish fantasy exists. There is such thing as Jewish fantasy. And even today, like, it's amazing to me, people still encounter a kind of pushback against very ideas that Jewish fantasy should exist. Okay, not that it doesn't exist, it does, but that it shouldn't exist. So, like, how do you situate yourself in this debate? Like, did you ever feel that writing fantasy somehow is non-Jewish, or like, what's the relationship between Jewish themes in your novels and fantasy?
It's funny. I love knowing that this debate happened. I love feeling like I'm glad it's happening over there. I can just sit here and write. I think when people start to say things like Jewish fantasy shouldn't exist, it really does get my hackles up, because it's like saying, well, that part of the human imagination is just denied to you. And it's like, why? What even? I assume that part of the impetus behind this is like that only realism can describe the depth and of the Holocaust and modern Jewish suffering and this and that. And it's like, it feels like a moribund idea to me. It feels like that is a stance taken from within a bubble, a very respectable bubble, a bubble that produced some of the most amazing literature of modern literature. But there's so many different ways to get at what it is to be human, to be Jewish, to be American, to be Israeli, to be anything. And to say that one of those ways doesn't have validity, I find it pretty, I want to say respectfully, but it's kind of laughable. It's like, no, what are you even? And yeah, so I don't I don't see my work as existing sort of within that argument, except that Bella would probably hate it. Oh well, you know. So I love his stuff. That's fine.
You're very forgiving. I don't like his stuff. So anyway, but you won't get any pushback from me on this subject. You know, I've been arguing that fantasy, speculative fiction, in whatever way you define it, is the genre, the mode for expressing the singularity and the strangeness and a kind of alterity which is at the heart of Jewish history.
Well, just the changeability. Think about changelings. You think about the way that people, you know, a creature that looks one way to one person and one way to another person, and the way that Jews define and redefine themselves, and that other people define Judaism. Is it a race? Is it a religion? Blah, blah, blah. And just that chameleon nature that has been forced on Jews for so many generations. I mean, what else in some ways but fantasy can describe that?
Exactly. I totally feel it. Like when I was a child in the USSR, this was my experience. You know, I was a changeling. And this issue of, do I look Jewish? Can I pass? Was really like, you know, was everyday reality. So yeah, I have like blue eyes and blonde hair, so maybe I can pass. But the very question of passing implies that you know you're different.
Yeah.
If you have to ask yourself, do I look Jewish? It means that you know there is such a thing as being different from the people who surround you. And so this leads me to my next question about passing. And this to me is a very interesting aspect of the novel, which I found totally fascinating, because the golem and the genie, they're not human, right? And yet they pass, at least in some way, for, you know, for human beings. And the fact that they do it in this immigrant milieu of turn of the 20th century, you know, America, and they constantly have to struggle with the issue of their dual natures because they're really not human. And I was really struck by how Hava, you know, transitions into this golem, you know, identity, and then she becomes human again. So I want to ask about this, not just the issue of Jewish passing, but immigrant passing. They're both, you know, immigrants. So they're non-humans trying to pass for humans, and they're non-Americans trying to become Americans, as it were. So how do you relate to this whole immigrant experience, and what part of the novel, like, my question is basically, is it immigration itself an important theme in the novel, or is it just, you know, because of the setting that you chose?
No, I think immigration as the theme was one of the, you know, one of the driving factors. I was saying to Vered's class that sort of a formative experience for me growing up was meeting other people, like friends of mine, meeting their grandparents, and they didn't have accents, and how weird that was. because grandparents came from somewhere else, families came from somewhere else. And the fact that was like what I'd internalized, and the fact that people could have lived in the United States for generations was just bizarre to me. So that was just a huge part of growing up, was knowing that my family, you know, on both sides came from somewhere else, where horrible things had happened and they'd had to leave. And so what happened was when I met my husband, and I was 18, and I found out he's Arab American, and it's funny, he's blue-eyed, and has hair about your color, and your hair's color, and he passes basically as, like, you know, your standard white kid from Chicago, until people find out his name is Kareem Kazkaz, and then it's like, oh, so what are the question? So what are you? And it's like that whole thing, that whole, you know, passing but not passing, was something he grew up with as well, and had to deal with. And his father had, you know, is came here from Syria when he was 30, early or so. Well, no, younger than that. Well, when Kareem was, after Kareem was born, and they came here, and his mom's from Chicago. But what I got when I got to know him, it was like this, oh, we're both weird. We both have families from somewhere else. We both have historical awfulness in our past to different degrees, but it's there. And we both lived like slightly off from culture, and it's from this, and it's this heritage of our families being from somewhere else. And that all was what got funneled into the book. And so I wanted it to be a coming to America story. I wanted it to be that immigrant experience story, to really dig into what does that do to a person. I listen sometimes to my father-in-law on the phone talking Arabic with his family, and he speaks so much more quickly in Arabic than he does in English, and he is like, his whole posture changes, and he gets off the phone and he's talking in English again, and he's like sort of like finding words, and it's like I feel like it's like I've known this guy since I was 18 years old. I'm 46, and it's like I kind of wish I knew you in Arabic too, because I don't know, because that's a different Ghaffar. It's the same person, but a different experience of that person. And so that's sort of, especially in the second book, in The Hidden Palace, that's sort of is in the after effects of immigration and assimilation. And at what point have you changed beyond, are you that same person? It's the ship of Theseus thing, sort of. Like, at what point, there is a through line of people, but who is this person and that person? If you put them together, what would they say to each other? So yeah, that was where it all came from.
No, totally. And it's a really interesting thing you just said about your father-in-law, which I totally identify with. I'm trilingual, so, English and Hebrew and Russian, Ukrainian, so 4 languages. I have a different personality, literally, in every language I speak. So, and my students are all bilingual, trilingual, whatever, and they all agree with me. When I talk to my students about it, they all say, yes, it's totally true. And I have students who are Palestinian Israelis who speak Arabic, and they say, it's really different. It's a different you. And so, like, my first husband was from Turkey, and he was blonde, blue-eyed. And when I met him, I said, I'm from Turkey. How come? Like, shouldn't you have like black eyes or whatever? He was very offended. But talking about stereotypes, we all have to live with those stereotypes, and we have our own stereotypes, right? But it's true. And my second husband is from Iowa, and he doesn't know me in Ukrainian or Russian or Hebrew, for that matter. And so he doesn't know some part of me. So I found this idea of a dual nature, and you talk about it in both books. And at some point, I think the genie says to the golem, you cannot escape. We all have our nature, right? We all have our natures in plural. And I loved it because, yes, we all have our natures, but what are those natures? And how can we live in such ways to be true to all of our natures? And in many cases, it's not possible, which brings me to my next question, right? And this is about history and historical fantasy. So your novel is not just fantasy, it's historical fantasy, which is a genre I adore, and I try to write in it. It's not very common, unfortunately. So I want to ask you, like, in general, about the relationship between history, fantasy, and Jewishness. What I mean is that there is a debate, a critical debate, about what makes a literature Jewish, quote unquote. So is it religion or is it history? Now, you don't use many religious, at least I didn't see any. And it seems to me that actually Judaism is not a very narrative religion. You know what I mean? It relies on reasoning, and not that I'm any great authority in Judaism, but that's how I feel. but the sense of history in your novels is palpable, and you really create the sense of being, is fine. So how do you relate those things that what makes, what creates Jewishness? Is it our history or our religion? Yeah. Whatever,
Creates like Jewishness like within a narrative,
yes,
within a
like
narrative.
what makes, or let me rephrase my question. Do you even think of your novels as Jewish fantasy, or is it just fantasy with Jewish themes?
I don't know, both, either. I think I think of it as historical fantasy with Jewish themes.
Okay.
I think, as and I don't know why that difference is there, and why I would say that it is that instead of Jewish historical fantasy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like, well, I don't want a pigeonhole, or if it's then I feel like I'm not reaching the audience that I want to reach. But I feel also like it could be any number of cultures that wrote this book.
Yes.
And it could be Asian, it could be Latin American, it could be any number of cultures that would write this book with this format, structure, drive, whatever thematic, whatever you want to put behind it. I could absolutely easily see it. And so there isn't something inherently, ineffably, inextricably Jewish about the book itself that could not be substituted for something else.
I totally agree. And I would actually give, if somebody asked me about your book, how I would classify, I would totally classify it as a historical fantasy with Jewish themes, because it brings Jewish history into dialogue with histories of, the Middle East and Syria and the US, right? It's a novel of immigrant experience, which obviously is not limited to the Jews coming to America. And I think lots of immigrants could identify with this book, even if they know nothing about golems or Jews or genies or whatever. So in this sense, I think as any good fantasy, it's universal. My favorite science fiction writer is Cixin Liu, who is Chinese. And I don't speak Chinese, and I'm not Chinese, but he speaks to the sense of alterity, difference, belonging, non-belonging, which I also find central to Jewish, fantasy. So in this sense, this is what I found very interesting about this novel. I could describe it as a novel of immigrant experience rather than specifically Jewish immigrant experience. Okay, so now I'm going to be perverse again and reverse what I just said and ask you about specific histories which are incarnated in the golem and the genie, because those are very specific histories. And you explain your background, and yes, and everything we write comes from our personal experience, and you and your husband is a great American love story. But still, those are histories in conflict. They started in conflict in the beginning of the 20th century, and they continue in conflict until today. So I'm curious, you could write a book in which the golem and the genie become enemies. And because they're so very long-lived, it would, develop into whatever. So I am curious about the Americanness of this story. You know what I mean? the US is the only place where the golem and the genie could meet as, if not friends, but in a kind of neutral territory, because they're both strangers in a strange land in the same way. Both are immigrants, both are, outside the cultural matrix. So what about the burden of history that each carries? And not just the history of the past, but also kind of history of the future, right? Because we all know, what happened in the Middle East afterwards. So it's a very general question if you want to relate to this issue of the burden of history and different histories and how they collide in America.
I think, people ask me if I'm going to bring it up to the present day. And for one thing, I mean, on the one hand, I think it would be an amazing thing to have like a life's work be just these books and have it be like the shelf of American history through Javan Ahmad's eyes from, turn of the 20th century up until now. But yeah, getting to those hotspots would be something that would present issues. I think some of it would have to be allegorical, because once you start with a golem and a genie arguing politics, it does. I can see it becoming like listening to your dad and your uncle argue politics at the Thanksgiving table. It's like, okay, does anyone want to read that? And this is something that I've had to sort of keep coming back to as I'm working on these books is, okay, there is the natural course of a life. There is the life that you can imagine someone living, and then there's what makes a good book. And those two are not the same. Right. And so if you want to get to the conflicts and the dilemmas that someone faces in the natural course of a life, in order to make a good book, sometimes it has to be about something else. Yeah. And so it would absolutely have to be about, I think, maybe absolutely, because there's always a way to do something. The question is, can I do it and still live a life as a person and take care of my kids and whatever, not just sit in a cave and debate writing all day long. But it would have to be something. Okay, so one thing I've known I cannot write about in the series is the Holocaust. I'm going to have to jump it. I'm going to have to have it be whatever comes after, If I end up writing through a future of these books, it would have to be like a time jump, and then like they're looking back at it. There'd be like the after the afterburden of everything, because one of the reasons is you've got a golem, you've got a supernatural creature. Why is she gonna go over there? Why can't she go and stop things? Why you've got what's there? Okay, this is probably lowbrow, highbrow, middlebrow, whatever. But the Wonder Woman movie, the first Wonder Woman movie that came out a couple of years ago, with Gal Gadot, and they've got her in the World War I trenches, and it was this amazing moment because I was like, you solved the problem. You solved the problem somehow. They did it. You've got a superhuman superhero in a World War I trench, but she's not stopping the war. And the question is, she's like affecting one small battle, and that and then it just sort of goes on from there, and she realizes that she can't stop everything. And it's like, okay, thank you for like taking that question and sort of addressing it, but also, it's the problem of like, why don't powerful people stop things? And I can't have that. I don't want to deal with that because I don't have the answer. Right. And so I need to jump that. As far as And maybe that's cowardice. I don't know. Maybe that's not wanting to, look at certain things and write about them. But I also feel like God, I can't take all of that on and have some answer that I don't, that I don't actually believe in, because there's a certain, you want there to be heroes. You want people to do the right thing. You want people to be able to go and do what history could not do. And I don't want to be someone who says, who makes it about the power of the human spirit when the power of the human spirit did jack shit, So that is not what these books, I think, that is not the work these books do. Go read Mouse, basically.
Which may become
yeah.
difficult nowadays.
Yeah.
Whatever.
But
Don't misunderstand
No,
me.
I know.
I'm not suggesting you should do it.
Absolutely.
I just love the way those books are. But I'm just trying, because we're not, we're talking about your books, but I'm also, I guess most people here into Jewish studies. So I want to kind of bring up various issues which sort of radiate out from your books, because those books are fascinating simply because they're opening up into so many different directions, American experience, immigrant experience, Jewish experience, fantasy, history, whatever. So I'm asking questions that don't necessarily relate to, to the specifics of the books, but just because I want to know your opinion.
And no, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm like pushing it back against the question itself, because I'm not, because this is stuff I ask myself all the time. And, do I have it, would I love someday to write a version of this book or something like this in which, like, Jews and Arabs explain themselves to each other? Yes. God. Okay, that's another, like, go into the cave for 10 years and come out with something. And and at what point, I think there's the writers run into these questions of, it's like, okay, what do I have to say about that? How is how am I going to say something that's, so much, that I feel is so much better or not out there already, that I feel like it, deserves to be written and put out there. And the answer is because, everyone deserves, if you feel you can put out something that is going to help explain people to other people, then do it. But it's a tall order.
Yeah, no, I understand. The reason I ask, actually, and you kind of answered my question when you started talking about the Holocaust, one of those many panels that I participated via Zoom, sitting in front of my computer, blank-eyed, was on Jewish fantasy, and specifically on Holocaust fantasy. And the whole issue was, what is it like should it be written? Is Mouse, for example, is it fantasy? Is it an allegory? What is it? Is it symbolism? And actually, there is quite a lot of Holocaust fantasy being written now. Most of it is dark, obviously, dark fantasy and horror. And I've written some myself. So I really wanted to hear your point of view on this, and I don't understand it. And for you specifically, for your characters, yes, they don't belong in concentration camps, because either they will be reduced to, pure victims, or they will have to do something which they cannot do, because we all know what happened, right? So a superhero or superhuman, or even an all-powerful, because they're both very powerful creatures in their own ways, they don't belong in concentration camps. So you answered my question. I was going to ask about this, so thank you so much. And so the final question, I think, is, no, I still have two questions. So yeah. I want to ask about Hava specifically and her quest for autonomy and being her own person, and she is a golem created as opposed to a genie who is trapped, but he is just a creature of his own. But Hava has been created for a master, right? And she's conflicted about her masterless status. So do you see it as a kind of allegorical representation of a kind of burden of history and how we're all trying to become our own creatures, as it were, but we're all created by, family histories, histories of the countries, our histories. So we're all golems of history in a way. So do you see her struggle as kind of representing a universal human desire to reinvent yourself?
Wow. I think partially. I think that's definitely one of the threads that sort of feeds into it. I had a hard time with her as I was sort of designing the character at the very beginning, trying to decide how much autonomy, how much understanding of the world around her she should have, how much autonomy she should have. I wanted her to be like, a good protagonist with her own, inner, drive and motivation. But how much motivation can a golem have? Well, let's see, let's play with that. And I think what a lot of like the master that she both longs for and doesn't want at different parts and sometimes at the same time is a responsibility to a community. And that is something, and history certainly going along with that. There's a lot of, growing up Jewish, growing up the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, there's a lot of implicit and explicit duty that gets put on a generation. And that shaped some of how I approached my Judaism. And it's something that helped make me into the person that I am. It's also something that I struggle with quite a bit. And it's something that I see as, and again, it's like, is this an explicitly Jewish experience? Well, my experience of it is explicitly Jewish. I know so many people from different cultures who feel, especially immigrant cultures to the US, it's the exact same thing. And, talking to my husband's sisters about this, who went through a lot of the same sort of stuff. And so it was that feeling of how much are you the person that you were shaped to be, and at what point can you deviate from that? How far can you deviate from that? At what point do we sort of, what is if that's your basic, well, for Hava, it's the question of her nature and wanting to be led by someone, and the fact that she doesn't have a master means that she is sort of led in little bits by the people around her. And in the second book, this becomes a huge point of contention between her and Ahmad, and where he's basically telling her, where they've had at one point in the book they have sort of a falling out, part of which is him saying to her, you aren't your own person. You are just the cumulative desires of everyone around you. You have no opinions of your own. You're a vessel. And there are certainly times when I felt like a vessel, as, and this is getting into psychoanalysts, and I probably, I should charge you, or you should charge me. But but no, it's, and how much of this is because I made her a woman? Would that have been, Shayna's nodding, would that have struck me as so rich a vein to mine if the golem in my book was a man? And when you look at empaths, when you look at in science fiction and fantasy, you got Deanna Troi on Star Trek, you've got oh gosh, who else? They're all, I can't, no one else is coming to mind at the moment, but it's like coded as a female ability. And that is, it's the daughters of the immigrants who, oh God, if you watch Encanto, the the whole, the whole thing about being under pressure. And so, yeah, a lot of that as burden of history is as burden of we are the ones who like made it, and therefore you need to because of the ones who didn't. Yeah, that all plays into it.
Yeah. No, totally. I understand. And that's why Ahmed is my favorite character.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I
Aw.
totally loved him. I thought he was fabulous. Hava is.
Hava. Yep.
Okay, so I guess we should, yeah. So let's open the floor to questions, please.
Yeah.
What do you think your motivation is for staying with these characters for so long? Because I remember in class you were saying like that the decisions put it in like 19th century or the end of the century, New York stuck with you for 15 years. So like why stick with this? Why not start like a new story? What is it that keeps driving you back to these characters?
Oh, good question. Oh, wow. Part of it is that there is so much that I can explore through them. One thing that opened up for me the reason why I started the second book the way the second book came about partly was research I'd done from the first book. If you start looking up, things that happened in the turn of the 20th century, it's like, okay, what was American society in 1900? What were the concerns of the day? What was it like to live in New York? You get not just 1900. It's like when you're researching, it's scattershot. You tend to get more of a wider range than what it is you're looking for. And so I had gotten sort of lost at one point in all this cool stuff that was happening in the 1910s and going into the 20s. And I would keep telling myself, Helene, this has nothing to do with the book that you're writing. This is stuff that you can't write about. So why are you reading this? It was like, well, it's just so interesting. And so I've just sort of put it all in a file on my computer, like for the future. And it was stuff like suffrage. What happens when a girl golem, like encounters the suffrage movement? There's some stuff you can work with there. Increase in mechanization and industrialization, like really ramping up. And there's stuff I was going to explore in the second book about silent film and the experience of immigrants coming to the U.S. and watching silent film and how it gave them a common language, quote unquote, because you didn't have to speak English to understand what's going on in, watching a Charlie Chaplin movie. And there was this whole visual lexicon that developed of, like things like you're turning a pocket inside out means you're broke because you got no money, and doing this means you're in love with someone, and all of these like sort of coded things that immigrants could watch and plug into and then repeat to each other or whatever, and how it was like this sort of great equalizer for the culture. I watched silent film for months, and I did all sorts of research, and none of it made it in the book. And so it's like every time I encounter something in the research, and the research feeds so much of the books, and I look at all this stuff and I'm like, how would Hava and Ahmad, what would they think of that? What would they and I start looking at it through their eyes, and then I want to write it. And of course, then I have to figure out what the larger thing is that I'm writing about. But yeah, I feel like I sort of, without meaning to, created a very open-ended thing for myself that could just go on if I wanted it to. And part of that draws me along. And I figure as long as it's drawing me along, that means it'll draw readers along, hopefully too. So there's sort of a bird in the hand sort of part to that. Also, just so much of my brain ends up in these books that I don't have I don't have much space, brain space for other stuff to think about. So like I'm sure if I like force myself to stop writing these books and just sort of like let everything lie fallow for a while, I would start getting other ideas. But right now, this is sort of it for me. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. And I apologize if my question is naive because I know next to nothing about fantasy.
No.
But you just described very meticulous historical research that you made for this book. So, as far as I'm concerned, if it's fantasy, it could mean anything, right? So, on the one hand, it's fantasy because it's a golem and a genie, and we don't have them supposedly in a realistic world, but otherwise, it sounds extremely realistic what you just described. So, have you thought about it when you were writing?
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's something that I had it sort of set out for myself as the scope of the book sort of came clear, and it was like, okay, what are the rules? What are the the rules I'm setting up for myself? And one thing I said was, I want this. I want it to be so that it's possible that this all happened and we just didn't know. And that was sort of my driving, my sort of overarching rule, guideline for myself is if golems and jinn were real, if such a posit such a thing happened, then this happened. And so I wanted it to be the New York that we know and the history that we know. Something that really annoys me is when people do historical fiction and get the facts wrong. So I try really hard to be as factually correct as I can. And that I know part of this is, okay, I'm not good at making things easy for myself. I like, if there's a hard way to get somewhere, I'm going to take it. Sometimes I'm like, why didn't I just invent some place that just doesn't, I could make everything up. And I look at all, other fantasy writers who like I'm friends with, and it's like, they made the whole thing up. They wrote down they made some rules for themselves. They like created a place in their head and they're just playing in there. And I'm like, well, I have to read these 4 books on prohibition and whatever else is going on. And they're like, oh, I just make it up. I'm like, yeah, I know. So that is sort of a, if I could go back in time and tell myself, it's going to be this much work, I think I'd still do it, because in the end, it's like, I've got these books and I'm proud of them. And I learned so much about just history and everything. It's just been a great ride.
And it's one of the great things about those books is the world, because fantasy has to create a world, okay? So even if you totally make it up, out of whole cloth, it still has to be consistent. But those books are really like rich in texture. So even if you don't care for the characters, it's just the world they live in is so vividly represented. So, and this is what, is in common between good historical fiction and good fantasy. Both creates like worlds you want to step into. More questions?
I have to remember this. Oh yeah. So while you were writing this book, there was some political cataclysm in this country and outside.
I didn't notice.
Yeah. And so it was interesting. You were talking about them as sort of apolitical figures in a way, and partly because they'll live forever. It doesn't. This is just one of those things that humans do. They go to war, right? So politics is the thing that makes them not human, because they're not too invested in it. But I want to know if you, over the course of writing, the political changes sort of altered the path of the story in a way that you were conscious of, or looking back, you see, wow, it just got really dark here, and that was because.
I stopped writing for a little while. In 2016, after the election, I was like, what the hell am I doing? And I think a lot of writers did that. Like, we had to convince ourselves that what we were doing mattered. And so that was like a giant damper on everything in my life, including the writing. The thing that affected the book specifically more than the 2016 election was the Syrian refugee crisis. Was looking at these photos of kids on the boats, dead on beaches, whatever, where it's like, they look like my niece and nephew, they look like my kids. And then, reading either articles or comments or whatever about, is this a Jewish, why should this be a Jewish problem? And that was, I tried at one point to make one of the characters, it actually altered the course of one of the characters, and I ended up turning it back again because I realized that it did not do the character justice, and it did not do the book justice, that it was me sort of ham-fistedly trying to respond to the to what was going on. But it was one of many. I mean, the book took 7 years to write, and it was just a struggle. The Hidden Palace. I mean, the first one was a struggle too, but the second one was a more recent struggle, and I'm still feeling it. But yeah, that was one of the things that, and it's like when something is so fresh, it's like, you should probably let it marinate a little bit and figure out how to do something useful in the book with it instead of just shoving something in there and being like, this is me responding. It led to a number of impulses that I eventually sort of went back on. But yeah, that was part of it too. Yeah.
How do you think it matters that you wrote it in English? Instead of whatever the language is. I mean, maybe like you personally wouldn't have written in another language, but how is English present?
English, it's funny, the second book, English is much more of a subject, a theme. One thing that comes out at the beginning of the second book is that, okay, as part of like constructing these characters, I decided that they both could speak all languages because that was, it's sort of a functional, trapdoor, it's a get out of jail free card for myself, basically, is I don't have to sit and, try to figure out who's translating and what language are they speaking. So what that led to was deciding that they talk to each other in a mix of languages, that it's a mix of English and Arabic and Yiddish with other phrases thrown in, that they're very self-conscious about, that this is like their lexicon between them. This is their love language, is the fun idioms that they pick up from listening to the humans of New York, and that they toss around with each other. And so in that sense, I feel like that there is a way in which like this book had to be written in English because I'm an English speaker. It's the only language I know, but it's the language that everyone relates to as an immigrant story. It becomes do you speak it? Do you speak it well enough? Do you not speak it at all? Do you speak it with an accent? Are you learning it? Are you, it's if there is a language as burden, it is English. And so that is, at least within the context of the story, I think the language that it sort of has to be, maybe unfortunately.
Have those novels been translated?
Yeah. The first one has, I want to say it's close to like a dozen or more languages at this point. Second one, not so much yet. Sequels, apparently, it's harder to get to translate. It was translated into Hebrew, the first one. Not translated into Arabic. There's not much that gets translated from English into Arabic. But also French, and if you consider like a large portion of the Arabic, speaking population can also, it's either English or French as well, then, you've got some choices. But yeah, I love seeing them translated. And what's hard though is getting questions from the translators. It's like, well, when you wrote this, and I'm like, oh God, I don't know. I just picked the word. The German translators, one of the problems was that der Golem, it's coded as male. It's a male word. Right. So what? And I can't. And they were like, they offered me like 6 different, in very German style, 6 different possible solutions, each of which had serious problems, and I don't even remember what we ended up with. It was I think it was what they wanted in the first place, and they were just asking me to be nice about it. But yeah, it's really awesome to know that it's out there being read in different languages.
Yeah, it's great. And
Yeah.
there is also cultural translation. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to visualize it in Russian, like
Yeah.
what kind of novel it would be in Russian.
Yeah.
It would be a really interesting novel.
Yeah.
But how much time do we have?
Yeah, I think we have to wrap it up.
Okay.
But thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really great.
Thank you so much. It was
Thank you.
fascinating.